This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 456 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Derek Carr was a massive bust last week. I know I wasn't the only analyst on him as a streamer, but he sucked. And he completely destroyed one of my fantasy teams. I got that totally wrong on last week's matchup show. Quarterback in general was kind of bad versus how things have gone over the last month or so. But I was right to be high on Wayne Gallman and Duke Johnson at running back. Giovanni Bernard was completely average, which I thought was going to happen. And I nailed the Cole Beasley versus Gabriel Davis dynamic. I didn't nail Antonio Brown being a viable option at all, though, and both tight end streamers that I mentioned didn't do all that much. The chaotic Week 12 is over now, though, and I'm thankful for it. I'm not thankful for Derek Carr, but I'm thankful that we can move past all the craziness that happened on and off the field over the last week. Hopefully, Week 13 brings us the goods. Now, before getting to players that I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus this week, I want to let you know that we've got another FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League here in Week 13. Enter the rake-free weekly NFL contest made exclusively for you, the listener, for just $5 and compete for your share for the $1,500 prize pool, including a $150 first place prize. To enter, visit fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. So I don't have many disagreements on the negative end at quarterback this week, but I'll give you four sort of QB2s that I think have a shot to post decent numbers here in Week 13. We'll start with Kirk Cousins. I talked up Kirk Cousins on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week, and the points that I made then still stand now. He's a good play. You know, since Week 6, Cousins has averaged just 0.6 fewer points per game than Russell Wilson. That's an arbitrary cutoff, sure, but it at least shows you that it's not like you're streaming someone who's terrible. You do run the risk with Cousins that the Vikings see a super positive game script, and that forces them to run the ball even more than usual. But this is a process-oriented play that makes sense. There's a high over-under in this game of 51.5 according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and the Vikings, as big favorites against the Jags, have an implied team total above 30 points. If the Vikings get to that total, Cousins, just from a probability standpoint, is likely going to have something to do with it. And it doesn't hurt that Jacksonville's been one of the worst teams this year in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. Ryan Fitzpatrick was also featured in the 15 Transactions episode, and at the time of this recording, I don't know if he's going to start this week. So be prepared for that. But if he does go, he's a really good play. The Dolphins are facing the Bengals and have an implied total of almost 27 points. Fitzpatrick's been sort of awesome from a fantasy perspective this year when he started, averaging 22.3 points per game in games started since his bad Week 1 outing against New England. The Bengals are a top 10 favorable opponent for fantasy quarterbacks as well, so I like Ryan Fitzpatrick as a streamer. I keep going back to Phillip Rivers on this show. I can't stop talking about Phillip Rivers. But he's been flying under the radar in fantasy. He's averaging over 18 fantasy points per game over his last 6, and like I said last week, that includes a 7-point outing against Baltimore. Now he gets the Texans secondary that no longer has Bradley Roby because Bradley Roby tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. And even with Roby for a lot of the season, the Texans have been a top half defense to target for fantasy quarterbacks. And don't forget, Roby missed a game against Jake Luton and the Jags back in Week 9. In that game, Luton, who was getting his first career start, threw for over 300 passing yards. Over his next two starts against Green Bay and Pittsburgh, which I get are tougher opponents, but over those two games, he combined for 320 yards. So Rivers is in a really good spot. Now, if you want to get a little weird with it, you could go with Mitch Trubisky. Now, hear me out. First off, for what it's worth, Trubisky has kind of owned the Lions, at least in fantasy. I'm not an analyst who often looks at trends against individual teams in years past because teams change so much. But it's still fun with Trubisky and the Lions because over his last 4 against Detroit, he's thrown 3 touchdowns in every single contest. But even if you just look at this year, which by the way, he did that back in Week 1, he threw 3 touchdowns against the Lions. But this season, in his completed games, Trubisky's averaging almost 19 fantasy points per game. He has multiple top 10 performances. The way he compiles his numbers is just kind of ugly. Detroit this season has been awful against the run, which is why David Montgomery is a great play this week. But they've been pretty bad against the pass too. They rank 11th worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and their secondary is 6th worst, according to Number Fire's expected points model. Kenyon Drake has seen really good usage over the last 2 weeks. He's averaged a running back rush share per game of 82%, and his target share per game average has been over 12%. That's better than what he's done throughout the rest of the season. Now, his snap shares haven't taken a leap. That's somewhat of a concern. But his usage as a receiver has been good to see. Now he gets the Rams. That's not the best matchup on paper, and I'm not trying to sell it that way. It's just that we've got to be aware that Drake's seeing this uptick in receiving volume, and he's acting as the team's goal line back. So because of those two things, I think he should be started as an RB2 this week, and I think he's ranked too low. Like, I'd be playing him over Wayne Gallman, for example. And Gallman currently is ranked ahead. Frank Gore was featured in the 15 transactions episode this week, and I do think that he works against the Raiders. Like I said on that show, Week 12 was the first time we saw Gore without LaMichael Pirine and Le'Veon Bell this year. And he had 86% of New York's running back rushes and an 11% target share. If he maintains that against the Raiders, a team that ranks in the bottom 5 in adjusted points allowed to running backs, then he should be able to finish as a lower-end RB2. I'm going to go back to Alexander Mattison as a deeper play this week, just in case the Vikings game does get out of hand. I mentioned him as a deep play against Dallas a few weeks back, but that game script didn't go as planned. That's why the pick was wrong. But this one could, given Minnesota is one of the biggest favorites on the slate. And Dalvin Cook has been a little bit banged up too. So there's always a chance that they use Madison a little bit more. There's really not that much to quantify this aside from game script could really be in their favor. And I hope that no one actually has to start Alexander Mattison. I do think the gap between Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray in rankings is too large this week. Murray has outscored Kamara over the last 2 games with Taysom Hill as quarterback. And he's also seen a higher percentage of the team's running back rushes. And since, like I said on yesterday's 10 Trend show, since Kamara and that backfield have essentially seen their target share cut in half with Taysom Hill, it's not like Kamara is getting this big advantage over Murray as a receiver. But Kamara is currently the RB7 on Fantasy Pros. Latavius Murray is the RB28. That gap should be shrunk a whole lot in my opinion. Meaning if we're high on the Saints backfield, we should be lower on Kamara and higher on Murray once again this week. Todd Gurley is someone who's going to be tough to trust here in Week 13. He returned to practice on Wednesday. That's great. He sat out Week 12 with a knee injury. But now he gets the Saints. New Orleans has been by far the best team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. They haven't given up a single RB1 performance here in 2020. Gurley's touchdown dependent for the most part to begin with, but in a tough matchup with a bad knee, I'm staying away this week. Michael Pittman Jr. had a tough game against the Titans in Week 12. He caught 2 balls for 28 yards. Not great. The good news, he saw 9 targets and a 21% target share. The peripherals were still fine. And now he gets that Roby-less Texans secondary this week. Not only has Houston been a top 10 matchup with Roby for most of the season, but the other piece of this is that Houston's actually been pretty good against the slot. Not necessarily because they're good at defending it, but because you can beat them on the outside. And Pittman has only played 29% of his snaps this year from the slot. So he gets a favorable outside matchup. I like him a lot this week. And I like Corey Davis as well. Of course, A.J. Brown is the go-to in this offense, but Davis is putting together a really solid season. He's averaged a 22% target share per game this year. And you might be thinking, well, that's skewed a little bit because A.J. Brown wasn't healthy to start the year. That's not totally true, though. Davis has almost a 24% target share per game over his last 6. He's been heavily involved. And now he gets a Browns defense in a game with a pretty high 54-point over-under that's been 11th worst against wideouts this year when looking at adjusted points allowed. Now, digging a little bit deeper, this could finally be Denzel Mims' week. Even with Sam Darnold back this past week, Mims saw almost 30% of the Jets' targets. He's now seen about a 27% target share per game rate since he started playing. And that includes a game where his target share is below 11%. And the Raiders aren't tough defensively. They're completely average in adjusted points allowed. So if the target share keeps up for Mims, he could have a strong Week 13. Now, looking down the wide receiver consensus rankings this week, Josh Reynolds, I think, is still just too low. Like, I don't have this out-of-this-world expectation for Josh Reynolds. But he's tied for 40th this season in wide receiver targets, and he's seen a 15.5% target share. That target share is over 20% over his last 5 games. And now the Rams get Arizona in a game that's pretty intriguing given both of these teams run at a fairly fast pace, especially Arizona. Again, you're not playing him over a lot of typical starters, but he's seen at least 6 targets in each of his last 5 games. For him to be ranked as the wide receiver 62, that seems just a little bit too low. Tyler Boyd is the one player at wide receiver who really stuck out to me as someone that's overvalued this week. He had a 22% target share last week, that's totally fine, but the Bengals offense was not effective without Joe Burrow, and Boyd ended up with 4.5 PPR points. This week, Cincinnati's facing Miami. There's nothing special about this matchup for me to say that Boyd deserves wide receiver 3 consideration. I just want to see the Bengals offense move well before I'm confident enough to play guys there. Maybe T. Higgins aside. There's no Will Fuller in Houston anymore, and the player who will probably benefit most will be Keke Coutee, because he's going to see more consistent snaps. But don't sleep on the Texans' tight ends getting more work too. Jordan Akins ran 14 more routes last week than any other tight end for Houston. And if you were to choose one tight end who's been the most reliable on the team this year, it's probably Akins. He's got 3 top 15 performances on the season. So I think he's in play as a streamer this week. And maybe we'll get lucky and he'll be more involved than anticipated, making him a decent starter down the stretch. Now, if you want the deepest of deep streamers at tight end this week, you could look to Cole Kmet. Jimmy Graham's been fine this year in fantasy, but over the Bears' last 2 games, Kmet's overtaken him as the primary tight end receiver. He's run more routes in both games according to Pro Football Focus. Now the Bears get this strong matchup against a bad Lions defense. Sometimes with streamers and really players in general, you've got to just bank on the peripherals like routes run and hope that they convert before other people are on them. And Kmet's currently the tight end 37 on Fantasy Pros, so no one seems to be on him. But the shift from Graham to Kmet seems to be happening. The Las Vegas Raiders aren't good defensively. They've got just 2 top 10 performances on the season in fantasy. But the Jets are basically the Raiders on offense. Opposing defenses this year against the Jets have ranked in the top 8 in all but 3 games. And like I said in the 15 transactions episode, no team has ranked worse than 16th in weekly scoring against the Jets. The Raiders should hypothetically have a high enough floor this week to serve as a streamer. But I do understand there's plenty of risk because they've been so mediocre. Now, another one of those super low roster defenses that might work this week is Detroit. I know I talked about Mitch Trubisky earlier on the show, but I also can't deny that Trubisky is a fantasy football dream for opposing defenses. He's been sacked 2.5 times per game in his starts this season, and he's tossing more than 1 interception per game. So Detroit works as well. But again, I'm not super into these defenses. I just think they're serviceable. If you've got Seattle based off of last week's recommendation, or if you can get Minnesota or something, go in that direction. If you can't, the Raiders and the Lions should be able to give you something based on their matchup. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. One more show this week, the mailbag episode, and that drops tomorrow.